Late August 1943. A humid afternoon settles over central Germany as a pale haze drifts across the runways of a Luftwaffe fighter base near Kassel. In the shimmering air above the fields, the low hum of distant engines vibrates like a warning that no one wants to hear. He stands near the edge of the tarmac, a quiet observer among the mechanics wiping oil from their hands and the pilots lounging beside their Bf-109s, pretending that the war is still unfolding according to familiar rules. The smell of hot metal and petrol clings to the air, mixing with the faint sweetness of the surrounding wheat fields. Yet beneath this ordinary summer calm lies a tension so thin and brittle it could be pierced with a whisper. He lifts his binoculars to the west, not expecting to see anything unusual, and that is when he notices them. Tiny specks far higher than any escort fighters should be, holding formation with the confidence of aircraft that know they can go wherever they please. At first he thinks his eyes deceive him. No fighter should be this deep into German airspace, not at this altitude, not at this distance from the channel. But as the shapes grow clearer, slicing through the faint blue haze with unnatural ease, he senses the beginning of a shift, a subtle rearranging of the war's geometry. The pilots around him glance up casually, assuming the silhouettes belong to the usual bomber streams, unaware that these shadows belong to something new, something designed for endurance, for reach, for the kind of warfare the Reich has believed impossible. He sees one of the base officers shrug as the formation glides overhead, as if the sky itself is incapable of changing the rhythm of their operations. "Probably reconnaissance," the officer mutters, "nothing serious." And with that small gesture of dismissal, the moment is buried beneath routine, filed away as an anomaly not worth recording. But he feels the air shift around him, like the quiet intake of breath before a storm. For months, the Luftwaffe has depended on one assumption, that the heart of Germany lies beyond the range of enemy fighters. This sacred belief has shaped strategy, training, deployment, every calculation of risk. Yet now, as he watches foreign silhouettes escorting bombers at a depth no one expected, he realizes that a door has opened in the sky, and something irreversible has slipped through. The High Command refuses even to discuss it. Reports are softened, sightings explained away, telegrams rewritten until they say only what men at desks prefer to hear. The old logic still governs headquarters. If something should be impossible, then it is. And so the warning travels upward through the chain of command like a seed dropped into stone, noticed, touched, but never allowed to root. He lowers his binoculars slowly, aware that he has just witnessed the first fracture in a structure built on years of confidence and habits. And though the bisecting lines of the contrails fade harmlessly across the fading summer sky, he senses that this brief glimpse will become the hinge on which the war turns. What he cannot yet know is how quickly this small disturbance will widen into a gulf that no amount of experience, courage, or discipline can bridge. And that the next time those specks appear overhead, the entire system will already be tilting toward collapse. And far above, beyond the hearing of every man on the ground, one of those distant engines shifts pitch, as if announcing that the real blow has not yet fallen.
The morning haze of early September 1943 drifted across the runways like a pale veil when Ernst Halder stepped onto the dispersal field, his notebook tucked beneath his arm, the distant thrum of returning engines echoing across the valley. The Luftwaffe fighters came back in fragments now, scarred wings, scorched exhaust lines, jittery pilots climbing down from cockpits with eyes that had once held certainty but now flickered with something colder and unfamiliar. Ernst watched ground crews rush toward a limping Bf-110, its left engine coughing out a trail of dark smoke, and he felt the unsettling shift in the air, not like a sudden blow, but like a slow tightening around the base, as though the sky itself had begun to recoil from them. The returning pilots exchanged hurried, incoherent accounts of their interception attempt, escorts where none should be, fighters appearing long before they could gain altitude, tactics dissolving before they could even be executed. He stood beside a cluster of junior officers, quietly absorbing each word while the senior staff insisted the problem lay in altitude misjudgments, late climbs, scattered formation discipline, Anything but the uncomfortable truth that the enemy was arriving deeper, earlier, and in greater numbers than the Luftwaffe's doctrine allowed. A young pilot with trembling hands described how he had aimed for the bombers, only to find himself intercepted miles before reaching firing range, caught in a ring of American fighters that moved with calculated precision. Ernst made a note of the description, sensing the pattern forming beneath the surface of these chaotic reports. The old defensive geometry was collapsing, and the commanders above him still spoke as though the map of Europe remained unchanged. By midday, he walked through the ready room where the mood had sunk into a heavy, resigned murmur. Crews talked in low voices of escorts that seemed to multiply in the sky, of bombers shielded as if wrapped in layers of steel, of attempts to break through the defensive screens that now felt as futile as swimming against a current that only grew stronger. Ernst watched a veteran pilot, one whose name was whispered with respect across the entire wing, sit beside his battered Messerschmitt and stare at the ground, hands unmoving, as if replaying every moment of the last engagement and finding no logical path through it. When Ernst approached, the ace looked up with hollow frustration. "They were there before we could even see them," he said softly. "Not reacting, waiting for us." Ernst wrote nothing. There was nothing to write that would soften the truth. The reports piled on his desk carried the same message, each phrased differently but echoing the same unnerving shift. The Luftwaffe was no longer choosing the moment of battle. It was stumbling into it already overmatched. Yet headquarters still dismissed these signs as temporary fluctuations, deviations that would correct themselves. Ernst knew better. Standing on the edge of the field at dusk, his breath misting in the cooling air, he felt the growing weight of a system beginning to fracture, its foundations shaken by an enemy who now dictated the rhythm of the war. And far beyond the horizon, those same enemy fighters were already pushing into a new depth, one that would soon erase the last illusion of control entirely.
The first days of October 1943 arrived not with the chill of approaching winter, but with the heavy metallic silence that settles over a battlefield before something irreversible occurs. Ernst Halder stood on the observation platform above the operations room, listening to the teleprinters clatter out casualty lists faster than the officers could read them. The maps on the wall lit up with red markers: Frankfurt, Schweinfurt, Emden, each indicating massive raids that carved open the heart of German industry with ruthless precision. But it was the numbers that chilled him most. Squadrons returning with half their strength missing, pilots downed not over the Channel, but deep inside the Reich, and losses so abrupt and disproportionate that even the most optimistic reports could not veil the truth. The old doctrine, built on tight formations, rapid climbs, and calculated intercept angles, was disintegrating before his eyes. On the airfield, Ernst watched a group of mechanics wheel the shattered remains of a Bf-109 into the hangar, its fuselage torn apart by cannon fire, its cockpit canopy missing entirely, as if ripped away by the sky itself. The pilot, an ace with more than 40 victories, had survived only because he managed to glide the last kilometers over a patchwork of burning fields. Ernst spoke with him later, finding the man seated on an overturned fuel drum, hair wet with sweat, hands trembling despite the cool autumn breeze. "They came from above, from below, from angles that should have been impossible," the ace whispered, staring at the ground as though the earth itself had betrayed him. "Every maneuver I tried, they mirrored. Every dive they countered. It felt like fighting the sky, not men." Ernst could offer no reassurance. He had read the intelligence reports. The enemy was flying differently now, coordinated, disciplined, relentless. By mid-October, a new phrase had crept into the pilots' conversations: Verlusttempo, the speed of loss. It was not merely that men were dying, it was how suddenly experience vanished, how entire units lost their backbone in a matter of days. Young replacements arrived from training schools with barely 40 flying hours, their faces still carrying the softness of boys who had never seen combat. Ernst watched them climb into fighters once flown by veterans, their hands hesitant on the controls, their movements stiff, their confidence brittle. They were being thrown into battles where even the aces were struggling to survive. And when the bombers arrived, streams of them stretching across the sky like iron rivers, American escorts swarmed around them with such precision that breaking through felt like trying to split stone with bare hands. The leadership clung stubbornly to outdated principles, insisting that tighter formations or earlier takeoffs would restore balance. Ernst attended briefings where colonels spoke with the confidence of men standing atop a map rather than inside a collapsing system. They blamed fuel shortages for late climbs, blamed inexperienced pilots for missed interceptions, blamed weather patterns for inconsistent performance, but never acknowledged that the core strategy itself had ceased to function. Each refusal to adapt widened the gap between theory and reality. Ernst saw it most clearly in the eyes of those who returned from missions, not fear, but confusion, as if the laws of aerial warfare had shifted while they were still in the sky. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon and turned the clouds a dull iron gray, Ernst walked along the runway littered with debris from emergency landings. The air smelled of scorched rubber and burned glycol. A group of young pilots stood near a battered FW-119, speaking in low, exhausted voices. "If this continues, there will be no one left by Christmas." Ernst paused, hearing the words settle heavily into the cooling air. He knew they were not exaggerating. The intelligence summaries he read nightly painted a picture of a force bleeding out faster than it could recover. Every raid chipped away at the Luftwaffe structure. Every engagement drained its strength. Every loss accelerated the collapse of doctrines once considered untouchable. And when he lifted his eyes toward the darkening sky, he sensed something even more ominous, an approaching shift more profound than anything he had witnessed so far. Because soon a new kind of enemy would emerge above those clouds, one that would transform this crisis into a catastrophe unlike any the Luftwaffe had ever faced. And Ernst felt with the quiet certainty of a man watching the final supports of a great structure bend, that the worst was about to reveal itself.
By late October 1943, the sky over Germany had begun to behave in ways Ernst Halder could scarcely comprehend. For weeks he had sensed an invisible pressure building above the clouds, as if the air itself were preparing to unveil something that would erase the boundaries of the war. That moment arrived on a morning cloaked in pale autumn frost, when the first alarms echoed across the operations bunker and reports poured in from the forward sectors. American fighters not merely accompanying bombers, but soaring ahead of them, ranging freely over regions once considered unreachable. Ernst stepped outside into the cold sunlight, feeling the unfamiliar vibration of engines at altitudes so high and so steady that they did not sound like the machines he had grown used to tracking. And then he saw them, glinting as they curved across the upper layers of the atmosphere, their silhouettes sharp and confident, moving with the ease of predators that had finally found their hunting grounds. The pilots who returned from that first encounter described the new machine in strained, disbelieving tones. A fighter with the speed to climb beyond interception, the power to dive without losing coherence, and, most astonishing of all, fuel tanks that kept it in the air far longer than any escort Germany had faced. Ernst listened as a shaken Staffelkapitän explained how he had attempted to outclimb one of these strangers, only to find the American aircraft rising beside him like a ghost that refused to be outrun. "I kept pushing the throttle," the captain murmured, his face pale, "and it stayed with me. I don't know how. It shouldn't be possible." But it was. Ernst wrote down the details: the unbroken escort coverage, the seamless transitions, the way the enemy fighters appeared above the bomber formations as if woven into the very structure of the mission. Within a week, the name spread across the bases like a whispered curse: the long-range fighter, The machine built not to guard the edges of the bombing route, but to dominate its entire length. Pilots began to report engagements deep inside Bavaria, in Saxony, even near the Austrian border, places where American fighters had never been seen. It was as though the sky had been redrawn overnight, the old safe zones erased. Ernst walked the length of the runway one evening while maintenance crews worked under dim yellow lamps, patching holes in wings that had met the new threat. He heard the voices of young mechanics arguing in hushed tones about the aircraft's capabilities, its improbable range, its endurance, its presence where no fighter should logically be. Even the most seasoned flight leaders could no longer disguise their unease. Ernst found himself studying intelligence sketches late into the night, tracing the outlines of the enemy machine, sleek, purposeful, engineered for long distances and unforgiving combat. The Air Ministry still attempted to downplay its significance, insisting that Germany's own developments would soon restore balance. But Ernst sensed that this was not merely an incremental improvement by the Allies, it was a rupture. A weapon designed explicitly to tear apart the strategic assumptions upon which the Luftwaffe had survived. Because with this aircraft, the American bombers were no longer vulnerable at the outer limits of their routes. They were protected everywhere, at the beginning of the mission, at its midpoint, and deep into the heart of Germany, where till now no enemy fighter had dared to linger. Standing outside the hangar the following morning, Ernst watched a group of pilots preparing for takeoff, their expressions tight with the knowledge that any point on the map could now be an ambush zone. The new enemy had changed the geometry of fear. The Luftwaffe was no longer reacting to raids, it was reacting to an escort that had removed the last operational sanctuary. When the first wave roared down the runway, engines screaming into the cold air, Ernst felt the old calculation collapsing. Altitude advantages, timing, fuel estimates, interception angles, all rendered nearly meaningless by a fighter that erased distance itself. And as the returning aircraft staggered back hours later, battered and scorched, their pilots shaken by the realization that they had been hunted across the entire length of the mission, Ernst understood that the war had entered its decisive phase. For if the enemy could reach every corner of the Reich, then soon there would be no corner left where the Luftwaffe could breathe at all.
By January 1944, Ernst Halder could feel the fatigue of the Luftwaffe not only in the broken aircraft lining the dispersal fields, but in the way the very bases had begun to sound. Quiet, where there used to be laughter. Heavy, where there used to be routine. And filled with the dull weight of men who woke each morning knowing the day would take more than it returned. The new pilots, arriving from training schools, looked painfully young. Boys with faces still marked by adolescence, stepping into cockpits once flown by veterans who no longer existed. Ernst watched them from the edge of the runway, their eyes wide as they listened to briefings they barely understood, their hands trembling as they secured their harnesses, uncertain whether their first combat sortie would last more than minutes. Germany's once proud fighter arm was collapsing inward, not from a single blow, but from starvation, of fuel, of experience, of time. Fuel rationing had become the silent assassin. Squadrons that once flew twice a day now scraped together barely enough gasoline for one shared mission every 2 days. Entire training programs had shrunk into brief ground lectures and a handful of low-power flights over empty fields. Ernst visited a training field outside Munich where instructors demonstrated maneuvers while the engines ran at half throttle to conserve every drop. "They're going into combat with less flying time than we used to give to students on their second week," one instructor whispered to him, voice cracking with disbelief. Ernst took notes mechanically, but no report could capture the look in the men's eyes, an awareness that the war was now feeding upon its own youth. By spring, the Allied air forces moved across the skies with brazen confidence. Their fighters roamed in packs, hunting not just bomber escorts, but anything that dared lift off the ground. Ernst stood on a small hill overlooking a field near Leipzig when the first low-level strafing attacks cut across the horizon, American fighters swooping down like blades slicing through the morning light. Trucks exploded in blossoms of orange flame,
Supply depots became fields of scorched metal, and aircraft that had not even left the ground were transformed into burning skeletons. The Luftwaffe now lost machines before they even took flight, a humiliation Ernst could feel deep in his bones. Victory no longer required destroying the fighters in the air. It only required preventing them from ever climbing into it. Inside the operations bunker, the atmosphere had become grimly methodical. Casualty charts grew longer, replacement lists shorter, and the thick binders of detailed tactical studies seemed to mock the officers responsible for reading them. Ernst listened one afternoon as a seasoned Gruppenkommandeur briefed his pilots with a quiet, brittle steadiness. "Your task is no longer to repel the bombers, it is to delay them. Delay is all that remains." The room went silent. Ernst wrote the words down, knowing that this was the first open admission of something the men had felt for months. The war was shifting from contest to survival. During the great bombing campaigns of the summer, Operation Argument, the attacks on synthetic fuel plants, the waves over Berlin, the skies seemed to roar with an endless storm of metal. Ernst traveled between bases and saw the same scene repeating like a ritual of ruin. Pilots stumbling from their aircraft covered in soot and blood, ground crews staring at empty spaces where returning fighters should have landed, mechanics wiping oil from their hands while their eyes drifted toward the horizon, praying they would not hear the distant roar that heralded another raid. The Luftwaffe was fighting with the residue of its strength, scraping together sorties with whatever machines still functioned, whatever men could still fly. But the most devastating change was something Ernst felt rather than observed. The defenders no longer believed they could win. It was not cowardice. Germany's fighters fought with the ferocity of men trying to hold back an ocean with their bare hands, but the sense of invincibility that had once defined the Jagdwaffe was gone. The new American fighter roamed the sky without fear. The bomber streams grew thicker, denser, relentless. And every time a squadron attempted to break through, a swarm of escorts descended with perfect coordination, dissolving the attack before it formed. Ernst knew that by late 1944, the Luftwaffe was no longer a shield. It was a shadow, stretched thin over a landscape, collapsing under the weight of its own exhaustion. Yet the final blow was still ahead. One last, desperate gamble, born not from strength, but from the fading illusion that something, anything, could halt the inevitable. By January 1945, Ernst Halder moved through the ruins of the Luftwaffe as a man walks through the remnants of a once great cathedral, recognizing every arch and column, yet knowing the structure could no longer bear its own weight. Snow fell in thin, colorless sheets across the skeletal outlines of hangars, settling on aircraft that had once been symbols of power, but now stood like monuments to a force stretched past breaking. A few men still hurried between engines and sandbag shelters, but their steps lacked purpose. Everything around them felt fragile, temporary, and marked by the awareness that no amount of effort could restore what had already been lost. The bitter cold muffled the distant thunder of artillery advancing from the east, while from the west came the deeper, steady hum of Allied bombers that no longer needed to hide behind clouds or nightfall. When Ernst entered the briefing hut, he saw officers bent over maps thick with red arrows pushing inward from every direction. Yet what struck him most was not the encirclement of German armies, but the thin, wavering lines meant to represent the surviving fighter units. Many of these symbols no longer corresponded to real squadrons. Some bases had machines but no pilots. Others had exhausted pilots but no fuel. Still others existed only on paper, names preserved in reports long after their aircraft had been destroyed. A commander standing beside the stove, its fire barely strong enough to warm the room, explained the newest directive in a hollow voice. Jet units were to be formed, reorganized, and thrown into action with whatever personnel remained. Ernst wrote this down mechanically, knowing the truth too well. The jets were technological marvels, yes, but they were entering a war that no longer had the infrastructure, training, or fuel to support them. He watched one such jet take off days later from a snow-covered strip near Berlin, its brilliant engine shrieking against the winter air. The young pilot who climbed into the cockpit had never flown the aircraft in combat. His training consisted of a handful of hurried sessions and a single supervised pass down the runway. Ernst followed the machine with his eyes as it climbed into the ash-colored sky, streaking forward with astonishing speed, and yet he felt no triumph. The jet was magnificent, but the pilot was alone. Alone against an enemy that controlled the skies with overwhelming numbers. Alone without fuel reserves for extended engagements. Alone in a system that was collapsing faster than new inventions could be deployed. The machine returned an hour later, its nose blackened by smoke, its pilot silent, trembling, unable to speak. Ernst realized then that technology had arrived too late for a nation that no longer had the strength to wield it. Across the fields, chaos had seeped into every corner of command. Orders shifted daily, sometimes hourly. Some divisions were told to defend airfields already lost. Others received directives to attack targets far beyond their range. Still others were instructed to fuse with neighboring units that no longer existed. Ernst saw mechanics dismantle aircraft to salvage parts for machines that might never fly. He watched fuel drums locked away like gold reserves, guarded by armed soldiers who had begun arguing over allocations measured in liters rather than barrels. The Luftwaffe was no longer an air force. It was a brittle arrangement of fragments held together by habit and desperation. In the final weeks, Ernst witnessed scenes that remained etched into him like scars. A squadron of 4 fighters rising into the gray sky, despite knowing that nearly 100 enemy aircraft waited beyond the clouds. A group of pilots in threadbare uniforms standing around a table, drawing lots to see who would receive the last remaining flight-worthy machines. A veteran ace quietly surrendering his aircraft to a 19-year-old replacement because he believed the boy might have a better chance of surviving. Every gesture carried the weight of a force fighting not for victory, but for the faint hope of delaying collapse by hours, perhaps days. By April, the end was unmistakable. Fighter bases were abandoned overnight, hangars torched to prevent capture, aircraft destroyed on the ground because there was no fuel left to fly them to safety. Ernst walked through one such base on a stormy evening, his boots sinking into mud, his breath visible in the cold air as he passed rows of fighters lying like fallen birds, their wings broken, their engines exposed. He paused beside a Bf-109 whose cockpit still held a pilot's gloves folded neatly on the seat, left there perhaps by someone who knew he would never return to claim them. And as the thunder of Allied engines rolled overhead one final time, shaking the earth with a sound that no longer met resistance, Ernst knew with absolute clarity that the Luftwaffe had ceased to exist long before the Reich itself fell. The war would end in May, but in the skies over Germany, the end had already come, quietly, completely, and without the chance of return.